So first, I would just like to welcome everybody coming out tonight. I know that you have very busy lives and schedules, and so just making a commitment to come out to talk about a subject that can be challenging and provocative at times. I just want to acknowledge the effort that it has taken today. And so thank you. And so knowing the sensitive nature of trauma, I just want to encourage anybody, if you're needing to take a break, or if you're needing to leave the room because maybe something is being said, please give yourself permission to do that. If you could benefit from any support during or after, please maybe grab Wayne during, and then you can connect with me afterwards. But again, I just want you to be as comfortable as possible when we're kind of talking about a subject area that can be very dear and impactful in terms of many of us have likely experienced this on some level. So the question is, so who am I, right? You want to know? So as Wayne had mentioned, I work at By Peaceful Waters, and I've been blessed to be overseeing their therapy services. And By Peaceful Waters has been, actually we're celebrating our 25th anniversary that's coming up. And we're literally just located close to Conestoga Mall, just where the Tim Hortons is on the corner. And we have several offices. So not only do we have a Waterloo office, but we offer online, and we have offices all across Southern Ontario. So our reach is broad, and our services are predominantly, obviously, psychotherapy, but we also have mediation services, and we identify as a Christian counseling agency. So again, if faith is important to you, if that's something that you want to be integrated into your therapy, we are more than happy to accommodate that. We don't impose our beliefs onto others, and we absolutely respect where everybody is at, but recognizing that sometimes folks who attend church or are part of a Christian community, going to a Christian counseling agency is familiar. And I always say that when we're going through something that's difficult in our life, it's important to be comfortable, right? So that's just a little bit about By Peaceful Waters. So I believe there are handouts on your table. Please follow along if that is helpful. I did create myself a little PowerPoint, and typically I would have had it reflecting on the back, but hopefully that guide will kind of support some of the areas that we're talking about today. So, what is trauma? And I've highlighted just kind of some of my favorite trauma therapists' kind of definition of what trauma is, right? Sometimes I would say that trauma is universal. Life is unpredictable, and life can be challenging, right? And so we all go through moments of stress, but then how do we know when it crosses over to us being impacted emotionally, physically, mentally, and spiritually, right? And when you've experienced trauma, you know what that looks like. You know how life becomes very disruptive, right? So here are just some definitions that I'd like to share with you. Jeanetta Fisher talks about it being an overwhelming experience that exceeds an individual's capacity to make sense of, no matter how resilient they are. It can be a single event, a series of events, or a set of conditions. Gabor Mate talks about trauma is a psychic wound that hardens you psychologically, and then it interferes with your ability to grow and develop. It pains you, and now you're acting out of fear. Trauma is not what happens to you. It's what happens inside of you as a result of what happened to you. Trauma is that scarring that makes you less flexible, more rigid, less feeling, and more defended. Bessel van der Kolk defines trauma not as a story of the past, but as the current imprint of that pain, horror, and fear living inside people. Resma talks about trauma can be anything that happens too much, too fast, too soon, too long, coupled with not enough of what should have happened. We know that when we experience dramatic events, it leads to a disconnecting from who we are. from how we show up in relationships, how we navigate the world, and even our relationship with God. And so as I kind of mentioned earlier, trauma refers to the experience that causes intense physical and psychological stress that emotionally disrupts us, and it can be a very emotionally disturbing or life-threatening situation. Now, as I highlight just these general definitions of trauma, what I do want to say that there's a big piece about trauma that sometimes can be a preventative factor, right? Because we know, and you've probably gone through it yourself, or you know loved ones, where there's something that just happens and that just suddenly causes a state of shock, despair, and overwhelm. And some people can process that in a way where they don't feel like they're impacted significantly. And the question often is, well, how come some can do it and others cannot, right? That's kind of the big question. But what I can say is we know that even though when we experience something incredibly upsetting, if we have access to spiritual, emotional, physical, and emotional support at the time of the event or shortly after, it actually is a buffer to us being impacted, such as many of you may be parents in the room. Maybe you've got young children or adult children, and you can recall maybe some upsetting experiences they've had in their lives. But because you were there to nurture and support, and that they can rely and trust on you, the impact of that event may have lessened or may not have been severe, right? So again, not just wanting to help folks understand that just because we experience something upsetting, it doesn't mean that it's naturally going to lead to a traumatic response. Remember, that's something that's internal. And a support system, a healthy support system, can really be a buffer and a protective factor. So, types of trauma. I would say that the first one I would describe would be shock trauma. That often is a result of feeling overwhelmed by just one event. This event can be sudden or unexpected, with a distinct beginning and end, and it can be relatively quick. It can abruptly interrupt the flow of life, and sometimes it can cause us to feel frozen in the event. And as a result, our world can feel like it suddenly falls apart or we're shattered, right? And some of the examples for that could be falls, right? Falls that lead to health issues, right? Accidents, that could be car accidents, assaults, acts of war, near drowning, natural disaster, medical procedures, loss of loved ones, even deaths, divorce, and separation. So again, just recognizing that some of those examples can be, can potentially lead to post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms that I'm sure many of you are familiar with in terms of that terminology. So again, just talking about the different types of trauma, that would be one. Developmental trauma, those are often, when you think about it, I was speaking to somebody earlier before I started about childhood wounds, right? So those are trauma that happens during our formative years as children, growing up to becoming an adult, where we didn't have somebody who was consistent, we didn't have somebody who delighted in us, we didn't have somebody to protect us, we are left on our own, right? And so again, abuse, harm, or neglect. And often folks don't think of neglect, but when you think about, we as a child need to rely on our caregivers, our parents, for survival. And when they're not there to defend us or to care for us or to help us navigate the world, we end up relying on ourselves. And it actually, and we're immature and we don't have the abilities, right? And so it often creates a sense of a lack of trust in relationships, right? And I think I also mentioned that one of my words I will say is that trauma blocks love and connection. Love and connection heals trauma, right? So again, just recognizing that Developmental trauma tends to be what happens in childhood, and it's just, again, the recognition of the value of a parent's love and care and concern and protection, and when that is absent, it can be very harmful emotionally, physically, and mentally for a child. Intergenerational trauma. Just nod if that terminology is familiar or you've heard that before. Yeah, okay. So this is where often trauma sometimes can be passed down through generations, even if someone hasn't experienced the event. And what I mean by that is, you know, you could have somebody in your family that has gone through, a sibling, a parent who's gone through something traumatic or a life-altering experience, and then they're raising the next family. And even though that those children have not had the experience, the belief systems are being passed down. You know, and often the belief systems is from a place of danger, alert. And so what are some of the belief systems that we might pass down is, you know, it could be some places might be identified as dangerous versus safe, right? So if your brain is always on this alert for danger, you could have a parent who might be really anxious when their child separates. And so that anxiety, that fear gets passed on to the child, even though they didn't have the experience of the parent, but they're carrying that anxiety as a result of the wound. And so, and that's just one little example, but, you know, or, you know, another example could be if, say, somebody experienced harm or somebody experienced mistreatment, they may not be mistreating their own child, but maybe they're using alcohol or drugs to numb the pain. And that's causing an absence from them being from the child. So although their own child is not being harmed, they still have an absent parent because they're relying on substances as a result of their own physical harm. So again, intergenerational, we don't have to relive the same event, but the woundedness, the brokenness, gets passed down in many different forms, right? So again, what are just some of the common symptoms of trauma? And my hope actually really today is if there is anybody in this room that is struggling with trauma or wonders if that's maybe some attribution to their reactions to things, I hope you walk away today with some confidence and some more clarity that might explain some of your reactions, you know, your worries, and your struggles in being able to control your emotions, right? So what are some of the common symptoms of trauma? Nightmares, right? So again, what is not processed properly tends to come out in our nightmares. So anybody here, if you're worried about something or stressed about something, you find yourself dreaming about it, right? Yeah, exactly. So that's what our brain does, right? We dream about things that we're worried about. And so it's not uncommon to have night terrors, right? Panic attacks, right? Again, when we've experienced something, then we worry that we're going to have it again, right? And so often anxiety can be a common feature, a feeling of worthlessness. I always say that if we struggle with any type of core beliefs around worthy, good enough, often they can be connected to kind of childhood needs or attachment needs that were not met. A feeling of numbness, hopelessness, a sense of shame, irritability, depression, addictions, a general chronic feeling of emotional overwhelm, kind of feeling unreal. And what I mean by that is children have an ability when they're experiencing something we call it to disconnect. To disconnect in terms of going into fantasy world, going into kind of and I say it's actually in a brilliant way. It's a brilliant way of coping with something that is just too much to handle in that moment. So kids will sometimes, they will go off into the fantasy. Well, that's how they've learned to cope. And so often as adults, I work with many adults who continue to do that. When they get overwhelmed or anxious, they just disconnect from their emotions, right? Because it's not safe, it's too difficult. And so part of that is helping them to ground them in the present and giving them the skills so that we can work through some of these traumatic experiences that still hinder them in allowing them to be spacing out. That's another word of saying that too, right? And if I look at the post-traumatic stress scale, right? So I recognize that I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist. I don't formally diagnose people, but I often will want to do the post-traumatic stress disorder scale on them just to kind of get a sense of where their symptoms are at, right? So again, some of these are repeated, disturbing, unwanted memories of the stressful experience, feeling very upset when something reminded you of that stressful experience. So again, a typical behavior is wanting to avoid any reminder of that event, right? And that could be people, places, memories, thoughts or feelings. Sometimes, we can have irritability behavior, angry outbursts, or acting aggressively, being super alert or watchful. So again, being jumpy or easily startled, having difficulty concentrating, falling asleep, a loss of interest in activities. So again, there's 20 features here, and there is I think a link at the end of your handout so that if you are curious, you can kind of go there, look it up on the web, go through those symptoms checklist to see again where you are on that. And I always say that, why I like to help people understand trauma symptoms is because I'm sure nobody has asked you what has happened to you versus what's wrong with you. And I like to ask people what's happened to you, right? Because this is the body's best way of trying to help you cope with things that were insurmountable and difficult. And so to me, symptoms are always a window into what's happened to you. And so hopefully you have people in your life that you can feel safe to share that story. But I think that sometimes when we have trauma symptoms, sometimes we might think we're crazy, right? Something's wrong with us. And I just want to encourage you to say, something has happened to me and I'm doing my best to cope, but maybe it's time to talk to somebody. So I don't know if there's any science folks in here in terms of the brain. So I'm going to just do my best version of a little education about what happens to us, what happens to the brain in trauma. So again, so we know we've got prefrontal cortex here, right? This is kind of the learning center. This helps us with problem solving, verbal expression, reasoning. And then we have the emotional state, which is the limbic system, and that helps us with nonverbal, emotional, relational experience, feelings, and gut memories. And then the lower part of the brain, which is right here, that is the brainstem, and that is our survival state. Am I safe, right? So again, all parts of the brain needs to be working together, but they have different functions, right? So thinking, emotional, survival. And so I often say too that we remember trauma with our feelings and our bodies. So what happens when we are stressed, overwhelmed? We are being reminded about a memory that has been traumatic or an experience. This part of the brain shuts down. So our thinking and reasoning is gone. Why do people struggle with memory? Because, again, it's shut down. This is the memory, right? And so we can't access this. So then what do we access? The feelings, the emotional center. So that's why we experience triggers, right? Smells, sounds, touch, sometimes a similar feeling that is connected to that memory, right? So that's actually what's going on. So we get often triggered by feelings and then even bodies. And what I mean by that is, let me give you an example that's kind of more of a, so I remember when I was 3, I've always had this fear of going over bridges with bodies of waters on both sides of me. No memory, but I always tensed up. Nobody could talk to me. I had no music on. I had to concentrate, and I had no idea why I had this irrational fear because I had no memory of it. Could not. And the funny thing is, my sister had the exact same fear, and we didn't learn this until we were both in our 40s, right? And then my mom heard us talking, and then she's like, oh, right, when you were 3 and your sister was sick, you were in your grandfather's car in Ireland, and he lost he lost control of the clutch or whatever, or the gear, and the car started rolling back, and there was an ocean behind you. Nonverbal. I wasn't obviously 3, very limited verbal language. But again, it speaks to the body keeps the score, right? So sometimes we can't make sense of the things until someone else fills in the story. And once my mom told me, it was like, that makes total sense because I have no idea. This happened pre-verbal or very limited verbal. And so I wouldn't have the memory, but my body knew what was going on. And so what I try to help people do in my work with them is to listen to your body. Trust your body. It's also a way of how it can communicate to us really important pieces, right? So again, so when I talk about the limbic system, that's the emotional state of our brain. It has 2 important areas. We call it the amygdala and the hippocampus. The amygdala acts like the brain's smoke detector, right? And the hippocampus actually connects the top and the lower brain, connects all the brain. So when we experience trauma, the amygdala in the emotional brain, the alarm goes off. And when the alarm sounds danger, this other part of the brain, the hippocampus, it shrinks, and then we're no longer able to detect past and present. So again, when the smoke detector goes off, the amygdala, there's an alarm, we're in danger, we're experiencing it again. Because we don't have our memory, we can't access our memory center, the body thinks that you're still in current danger. And so it can't differentiate between past or present. And I often say to folks, it's overwhelming. The fear is intense. And in some way, something in the present has triggered you, but your body thinks it's still in the past. And so not only are you dealing with the present stress, but then you're dealing with the enormity of all your history. And it feels crushing and overwhelming. And so what I like to do is, when I work, I try to slowly kind of separate that, help people to start catching their triggers, start making notes of when you're overreacting, or when, I don't even like using that term, but when you are having strong reactions, start charting them so that you can start distinguishing, right? And so that's what can feel so overwhelming. That's why we call it the legacy of trauma, because trauma feels it's still active, it's still happening, it's not over. Your body is still thinking it's present, right? And then what happens with the brainstem when we experience trauma? Our heart rate increases, right? We start having shallow breathing. So some of the very practical things to do is just start breathing, start doing deep breaths, right? Our muscle tenses up, and we either kind of speed up or we just collapse, right? Depending on if it's too much for us. So again, often when folks come to therapy, they'll say to me, Karen, I don't feel like I have any control over my emotions. It's automatic response. And I would say, yeah, that's exactly, because remember, it's the body and the feelings. So you're noticing that you don't have any control. So we have to start noticing, we have to start catching, and we have to start building some skills there. So again, this is just the body's way of working with us, of telling us that there's things. So I always want to validate people. Yes, it absolutely feels like you have no control because it's an automatic nervous system response. We're dealing with a nervous system's response that has lived this way for many years, and we need to start understanding it and what it needs to heal, right? And that's why I say trauma work is not only top down, which is working with our thoughts and our belief system, but it's also bottom up in terms of working with our nervous system, working with our bodies, right? So what are common trauma responses? And this might be familiar, and maybe these are some responses that you can identify with. Fight. Whenever we're in a perceived threat, or we're in a situation where we perceive a threat, or we're feeling challenged, we might feel like fighting aggressively is what's helpful. Sometimes that might have been a very helpful strategy. I think about folks who tend to move towards fight. It could be, maybe they've had to, fighting their way out of the situation actually was helpful, right? Using aggression to keep people away from them is a helpful strategy too, because then nobody can hurt them, right? So again, it could be a bit of a protector. Sometimes it could be like, this is how I get my needs met, right? So again, just making note of what response that you tend to go in. And sometimes we fluctuate through all of them, right? So the next one would be like flight, right? So flight would be, I need to get out of here. I need to run away. It's not safe here and I'm just gonna leave. And so we could physically leave, right? Or sometimes we could just mentally leave, right? We just disconnect, right? Another one is freeze. Often when we're in a situation where we don't know how to respond, or often think about the deer in headlights, right? Something's just happened, you're shocked, you're confused, and you literally just freeze, right? And so you don't know what to do, and so you don't do anything. And it's often a sense of an inability to move or act against a threat. Flop, I would use the term collapse. Sometimes in the midst of something threatening, especially if we have experiences through our childhood. I think about when anybody sometimes has power over us and we don't have the ability to leave, or we don't have the option of leaving, we sometimes just collapse. And what I mean by that is have you ever seen, I know this is, maybe, I don't know if this is the best example, but have you ever seen an animal that has been captured and it goes limp in the mouth of another animal, right? Because it doesn't see any liable option out. And so it goes limp in the mouth of the other animal. And then when that other animal loosens up and thinks that this animal's dead, then they get their energy and they take off, right? And so sometimes I always say that rather than looking at it as trauma symptoms, what if we renamed it as survival strategies, right? That feels very different. So knowing that collapsing and disconnecting from your emotions and suppressing them was how you survived it, right? It allows us to have a lot more compassion for ourselves when we look at things just a little bit differently. And the other one is fawn. And this tends to be that we tend to please others to avoid conflict, right? And so that, again, could have been a helpful strategy at some point in your experience, where if you were to appease the other person, make them happy, cater to their needs, then that reduced the risk or potential for harm for you. So again, helpful. These are all helpful strategies often in the time. What often I end up working with is that people are coming to see me when these strategies are no longer working for them. The trauma has ended, but they've continued these patterns, and it's causing them more suffering. And they're just wanting help to make some changes. And so the thing that I love about the brain is that we know that God has also designed it for healing. And that's why it's the gift of neuroplasticity. So as much as I talk about trauma, I want to encourage and instill hope that there's an ability to change and rewire and create neural pathways for healing. And I'll give you an example. So when I mentioned earlier about knowing your nervous system response, often I will introduce kind of the concept of window of tolerance. And basically all that is, it's a helpful guide to start noticing where you are on a daily basis in terms of your emotions, right? Start noticing your emotion states. Are you feeling anxious? Do you feel out of control? Is there an overwhelming feeling? Do you feel irritable, agitated, right? Or are you in the other state, which we call hypoarousal, where you feel numb and zoned out, emotionally and physically exhausted, absent, depressed? You feel like you know that you're moving, but you don't feel alive. You feel like you're just going through the motions, right? And so this little picture that I like to show to folks, it's not about judging or criticizing where we're at. The goal is not always to be in this window of tolerance here, which allows us to have clarity and we can be calm. And then when emotions come in, we can decide how we want to handle that. We can still make decisions. Remember, this part of the brain is still online. We can still access it for critical thinking. But we know that stress and trauma shrinks this window, right? And so part of knowing your nervous system is just starting to catch, where are you? Do you tend to vacillate between these extremes on a regular basis? Is there a place that we can help you get out of fight, flight, or freeze, or shut down? Can you experience relaxation, calmness, right? And so it's retraining the nervous system to not be at fight or flight response, right? That danger response, which trauma causes us to be in all the time. And so, again, I encourage folks to just start charting that. When folks come into counseling, I will say, just let me know where you're at right now, right? Just so, again, we can start using different terminology. We can start identifying our emotional states. And so when we are doing trauma work, we have to be in a state where we can handle some of these triggers and some of these difficulties. And so if we're overwhelmed or stressed, we can't process anything, right? When we're so detached and disconnected, everything's at a distance, right? So we have to build some just practical skills and some ability to kind of work through the experiences that have led you to surviving this way, right? The losses would be when we're detached, we're absent in our relationships, right? We're doing kind of all the emotions, but we're emotionally absent in our relationships when we're always disconnected, or we become workaholics, or we develop whatever ways. Again, these are coping strategies, right? If we're anxious all the time, we're irritable, we're frustrated, we start being really controlling. And again, it's not intentionally to want to harm others, but we start imposing conditions and the what, to's, and it can come across as very controlling behavior because we just want to keep ourselves safe, right? So again, there's benefits to it, but there's also personal costs. And so when we think about trauma treatment, what does that look like? And so, as I said, when we have a nervous system that is always on alert for danger, and you're constantly scanning, you're constantly trying to make decisions for yourself that reestablishes safety, I often take more of a body approach initially. And so the first would be breath work. Even just, breathing in deeply, holding it, and releasing it. We know that we often have shallow breathing or hyperventilation breathing when we're anxious, when we're panicking, right? And so the very first step is to catch your breath and to actually, and breathing really helps to reset the nervous system. It helps to bring a sense of calmness to us. So as much as we talk about breath work and the simplicity of it, it is a really helpful strategy. The other thing is grounding. Remember, your body and your feelings are in past time. And so I need to reorient your body to the present. So how do we do that? I simply just ask, what are 5 things that you see? What are 4 things that you hear? 3 things that you smell? 2 things that you taste? 1 thing that you can touch. And again, it's an effort just to reorient the body to the present. The mind is in the past with that experience. It thinks it's reliving it now. And so I want to bring the body back into the present, and it helps to ground us, right? And it could be drinking a glass of water at your table. That helps to ground you too, right? Temperatures. Making eye contact with somebody, that helps to kind of, bring us back to. So there's things that you all do that help to manage that anxiety, right? And then sometimes we just need some assistance. Movement is another thing that I often recommend. Often when we feel frozen, can you wiggle your toes, right? Your fingers, and slowly kind of work your body. So any walking or running or dancing or singing, again, these all create a sense of safety and calming in the body. When we are spacing out, such as that we're disconnecting, I will often like to ask about, what's the date, the time, the location, and ask that person, how old are they right now? And again, that's my effort to distinguish between the effects of what they're experiencing now, likely represented in an earlier age, and bringing them back to the age that they are now to help differentiate past, present, right? Because remember, we can't do this when we're going through that. Again, any type of muscle relaxation. There's so many different forms out there nowadays. Guided imagery, you can get a ton on Spotify or many different apps where it's basically it could be, we know that nature and tranquility can bring a calmness. So guided imagery around water, beaches, whatever that is for you that inspires and creates a sense of relaxation. Meditations, scripture and prayer can be helpful for that, especially as Christians. Self-talk, and this is often something that I will tell folks, is just when you are being triggered or being evoked with a kind of an overwhelming sensation or feeling, just tell yourself that this is just a flashback, that this is just a memory. It's not happening right now. You're safe. And that no one is presently harming you. And there's no there's no external threat right now to your safety. And sometimes I will encourage just to physically turn your head left and right and look around so that you're scanning and you're assessing if there's actually any present danger right now. And that's just, again, a way of reorienting your body back into the present. And it actually our brain has been created in a way where it's always looking for the why. It's always trying to make sense of something. It's always trying to understand something. And so if you give if you just tell your brain, this is just a flashback, this is just a memory, it surprisingly settles it, and it works, right? So self-talk is really, really important in terms of helping us. So I call it, another piece would be like somatic self-care. We know that just as we talked earlier about night terrors or dreaming about things that's overwhelm or stress us out, even just having 15 and 20 minutes of physical exercise can help move us out of those fight or flight responses, right? So physical exercise helps to bring calming and relaxation to the body when we are dreaming about past experiences that were quite upsetting for us. Again, it's the brain's way of being in a fight or flight response. So physical exercise can help with that. It helps to reduce it helps to reduce the stress hormones, increase the endorphins, right? It helps to regulate our nervous system. I always say reduce your stress by putting it out in words or journal. One of my buzzwords is name it to tame it. If you can get it out of your head, sometimes that can be helpful too, right? Instead of ruminating and thinking it over and over, just get it out on paper, put it out in journal. There's something that can be relaxing from that. Establish bedtime routines. Sometimes at nighttime, bedtime routines can be the hardest for folks. And so do whatever you can to relax your body, whether it's a warm bath, whether it's, again, a meditation, a mindfulness, or a guided imagery exercise, just whatever ways that you know best that can help with some level of relaxation. And then the other one is like rescripting your nightmares. And so what I would say is that often we have the same type of nightmare that plays over and over and over again. So if you were to, and it's just helping your brain kind of process it, if you were to take the worst part of that nightmare and rewrite it where it's no longer upsetting, and then kind of recite it to yourself before you go to bed, it's quite possible that over time that will get resolved so that you're not dreaming about it anymore, right? So again, these are just little strategies that could be helpful or not, depending on, if you try it. Pathway to healing and recovery. So how do we begin that process that might feel very daunting or overwhelming? We know to begin healing, it's important to tell our stories in connection with others. Being able to process our emotions and find meaning. I mean, that can happen through friendships. That can happen with another person in your life who you are comfortable with and feel safe. But often it happens with professional support, because with trauma, we tend to hold to ourselves, and the shame from the trauma keeps us silent. And so, as I mentioned earlier, trauma blocks love and connection. And to heal trauma, it's through love and connection, right? And just be able to acknowledge the past and recognize when you're being triggered, right? So again, mapping those times that we're being triggered, pretending we're like a private investigator and we're trying to understand all the elements of what we went through that is being triggered. And again, it could be, things of that memory that is similar in terms of physicality. It could be a feeling state, or it could be like a belief thing that we have about ourselves that gets evoked within that context. And then being able to integrate what has happened to us and move on. As Christians, we know trauma can have profound and far-reaching impact on our spiritual journey and relationship with God. As I mentioned, not only does it disconnect us from ourselves and each other, but also our relationship with God. But I also want to recognize that the Bible has transformational power, and its principles can be healing to us. King David's Psalms is an excellent example that I think it's okay to be raw and honest with our expressions of grief and despair. We know that the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Finding refuge and strength in God in times of trauma. We know that God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. What does the Bible say about supportive environments? We're not meant to bear one another's burdens. We are to bear one another's burdens and to fulfill the law of Christ. So again, that kind of connection is really helpful for our healing. And then also just, renewing our minds. Often what I would say is that when we experience trauma, we develop beliefs and decisions about ourselves at that time. And often these beliefs and decisions can be limiting. They're lies about who we are, right? And so if I believe that I'm not good enough as a result of something happening to me, then I continue throughout life feeling not good enough, that something's wrong with me. And so just recognizing that often we develop identity lies, vows about ourselves, beliefs about ourselves as a result of what's happened to us. And so part of it is going back into those areas and kind of bringing those beliefs that we've said to ourselves unconsciously to the conscious for healing, right? And so I know I didn't mention it earlier, but I am a EMDR certified trauma therapist. I'm not sure if folks are familiar with EMDR. I think there are maybe a pamphlet on your table. What we do know about eye movement desensitization reprocessing, that's what it stands for. It's considered one of the most effective treatments in treating trauma and PTSD. The intervention that we typically use, what I often say is EMDR is not hypnosis. There's nothing mystical about it. It's basically just allowing the integration and reprocessing of a stuck or frozen traumatic experience, right, which is in an isolated memory network. Basically, when we're overwhelmed, the left side of the brain shuts down. I always say it goes offline in the process of when we experience trauma. We're only left with the data download on the right side of the brain, which speaks to why we get triggered from a sensory perspective. And so we need to reprocess the trauma because it's kind of stuck and it's unprocessed, right? And so EMDR helps to move that traumatic memory into a place where there's some resolved and we're no longer showing symptoms. So some therapists will go after the symptoms. They will, when they meet with a client, they will work with the symptoms. As an EMDR trauma specialist, I go after the memories because I believe the memories are causing the symptoms. And so again, that's just a recommended treatment for anybody who feels that they could benefit from that. And as I mentioned, there are resources that are attached kind of at the end that could guide you and support you, and even just to gauge where you're at in terms of, am I showing any of these symptoms? And some of the resources that could be helpful in understanding and even, hearing what, how you can get help, or what are some of the other treatments that are available as well. So that is the end of my little presentation. I know that it was a lot of information to absorb. But as I said, I mean, we want to take the shame out of trauma, and we want to normalize it because life is difficult and life is challenging, and we do our best and we make the best choices that we can. And trauma is a result of what's happened to us. So let's just get healing of what's happened to us. Thank you.
So we do have some time for question and answers. The questions will not be on the recording, so you don't have to worry about your identity on the recording, but I will likely have a recording of the answers to the questions.
Seven-year-old twins. Yeah, so I'm assuming there might be lots of crying, right? So I guess what I'd say, so when I think about it, I always go to like what response would be appropriate for like a 7-month-old, right? And so when you think about what is one of the most grounding techniques for children, or even for all of us, touch, right? So when you think about swaddling, right? Or even just, hugging them, right? Any kind of sense, because touch at that age it creates this felt sense of safety, right? And so if a child is, again, I would think, again, what would be typical behaviors, maybe, again, it could be stiffness, right? Not wanting to be touched, or it could be long-lasting crying that just keeps going, right? And so your goal is always to soothe and calm. And trust often has to be reestablished. And how do we do that for a 7-month-old? We feed, we change, we make them comfortable, we respond to their cry. So again, all of that helps to regulate a child's emotions, and it also helps them to know that I can trust you, right? And so I just encourage you to be consistent and to be patient and to keep responding to their needs. So that speaks to your great work, right? Because you're right, if touch wasn't safe before, then of course they're not going to want it, right? And so I think it's really important for as parents, as caregivers, to really be attuned to what would be helpful for that child in that moment. What do they need, right? Because you're right, if we've come from a healthy system, we would assume touch would be helpful, but you knew that there was something maybe there, and so at first they didn't accept, but now they are accepting it because they know that your touch is safe, right? And again, by doing that, you're actually creating new neural pathways in their brain. This is where about the opportunity to heal, where they can associate your touch with safety. And again, if you continue to do what you're doing, you're going to help these kids grow up and heal from that. Yeah, so I would say that anyone who's experienced trauma, like we've all, we tend to, I always say that there's four things that tend to fall with, like, in terms of how it impacts us, right? The beliefs that we hold, right? And so often it's, I'm responsible, it's my fault, I did something wrong, there's something inherently wrong with me, right? Or I can't trust anybody, I'm not safe, I feel powerless, I have no control. And so when I think about belief systems that we develop as a result of trauma, it's often around responsibility, safety, and control. And then when we ascribe that to us, we become shameful, right? And so when we experience shame, we become invisible and we don't want to tell people. And so we retreat, right? And we feel as if somehow, again, there's something inherently wrong with me. We're not lovable. I'm not good enough, right? Relationships aren't safe. I can't trust anybody. I'm on my own. I'm all alone. And so again, those are the impact of trauma, and part of it is being able to, once we're able to start talking about it, then we realize that those beliefs and decisions that you made by yourself was how you interpreted the event, but maybe there's another story, right? And so the hope is that we can depersonalize that a little bit, maybe add a different meaning, and so that there's not that shame. And then when we kind of work through the shame, then you can maybe look at the experience, assign fault where fault needs to be blamed, forgive yourself that things that you took on that you didn't need to, right? And so sometimes just in conversations with others, we can start seeing other perspectives. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I just think that, we were not created to be alone, right? And but safety and trust is incredibly important to begin that journey. And so, I just know that, life's too challenging to be on your own, right? And as I mentioned earlier, because trauma has led to us being that way, it's almost like, we also need to go back into relationships to heal it. Yeah. So we know that trauma does impact the memory, right? We have fragmented, split, sometimes no memories, right? So we know that trauma does that, right? Because this part goes off. And so that can be true. We also know, I think sometimes what I'm looking at, especially when I'm doing kind of like an initial trauma screen and symptom checklist, like when we are able to move through our healing, the trauma memories don't have the same level of holdness on us. What I mean by that is the intensity decreases or symptoms completely eradicate. And so one could say that we reach a place of resolution. I mean, it's like grief. Grief is actually a part of trauma. We're never going to look back on that and think that was the best thing that happened to me, or that I'm glad I experienced that, right? Because we're permanently changed. But that event, those years of experience, don't have the same level of control over us anymore. We have more control over our emotions, and we are choosing to live a life out of health now rather than fear and anxiety and defensiveness. And so when I think about it's not uncommon for folks not to have memories of childhood if there's been lots of upsetting or traumatic experiences within that attachment, right? So again, not having many childhood memories, that's not an uncommon feature. Again, depending on how so if you go through like a present thing and something has been really upsetting and you don't have any memory, maybe that's just a natural nervous system response that you've already had where you just disconnect already. You're just gone, right? So again, that could be a coping strategy, right? But it's something it's something to be curious about, right? Yeah. And there could be other features to that too. Like I'm thinking other developmental, like ADHD, or other kind of developmental features that can affect memory. There's so many, like I'm always very mindful that a lot of symptoms might represent trauma, but I think I also don't want to how do I say it? Trauma's not the only lens to look at behavior either, right? And I always say that our brain has a natural orientation to remember the negative, right? It's, when you think about it, any performance of appraisal that you've ever received in your life, you could have given 20 applauds, and that one constructive feedback we tend to hold on to, right? So there is something natural within the brain that does tend to hold on to that. And I always say about, just again, be curious about the balance, right? Because if we've been in a situation, especially with, again, attachment, parents, or even any relationship where our confidence has been eroded by lots of put downs, by lots of hurtful words or whatever behavior, it's going to affect how we see ourselves, and sometimes we also, if we are in a relationship and that person is often critical of us, again, it's not uncommon to internalize some of those voices too, right? So what I would say is, if you consistently struggle with core beliefs of I'm not good enough, something's wrong with me, I can't trust anybody, like I'm ashamed, right? Sometimes these could be windows to more deeper childhood wounds. So I would just say that it's normal. I would just pay attention to whatever that repeated audio is going on in your mind in terms of beliefs about yourself, right? And again, some of those really deeper things that I'm not good enough, I'm not lovable, sometimes they absolutely can be connected to childhood wounds. So what I would say is we can't change the past. We can't redo things that's happened to us, right? We're only responsible for our healing. And again, when I said earlier about often when we experience traumatic events, in that moment we make decisions about ourselves and beliefs about ourselves. And so decisions could be, something's wrong with, or I'm unlovable, or I can't trust anyone, and then you might make a decision in life that you're never going to rely on anybody for any help, and you're always going to be on your own, right? And so again, we often make decisions to protect us from future harm, future injury, right? And so top down, bottom up. So part of it is challenging some of those thoughts and beliefs that we've established at the time of injury is absolutely true. But trauma is holistic. It's not just the mind, right? It's so much more. It's the mind, it's the emotions, it's the physical system that we respond to in trauma when we're threatened, right? That fight or flight. So I would say it depends, right? But we know that especially with an EMDR therapist, I work with the emotions, I work with your thoughts, and I work with your nervous system, the body, right? So it's not as simplistic as that. But there is some element of truth to that, right? We have to challenge some of these core beliefs that we have that might be outdated because you're no longer in that situation. And it's causing you more suffering because our thoughts do cause us a lot of suffering. So when folks come to me, say, for anxiety and depression, right? Like, you can just treat the anxiety and the depression, or maybe I could do a little bit more of an understanding of what has been some of your experiences, right? And so I also think the body has an ingenious way of protecting us because sometimes the truth and the reality of this is too much for us, right? So in some ways, if you look at symptoms, it's almost like okay, now you're going to have this because you're able to handle it. It's like the body's kind of gently telling us things have been happening, right? And so again, people can absolutely have no memories, and then they can have memories that come forward. And even when I do EMDR, I always say, be mindful that new awareness might be coming out. Yeah, so that support system that you're talking about, that is so incredible. That's actually one of the things I often ask folks are, who are the people in your life, right? Because we really, especially if we're going to be doing trauma work, you really want to have those accessible resources available to you, right? I recognize the limitation of me seeing you maybe once a week or a couple of times a week, or even weekly or bi-weekly. So again, I'm always wanting to make sure that if we're doing this difficult work, who do you have outside of this, right? I promise, I never promise people will be comfortable, because I think just working through this, we're all going to be uncomfortable, right? But as a therapist, my job is to keep you safe and to be responsible for that. And so, love that, because you're right. I'm always asking who are your people in your world, and that's why I'm very clear. Like, yes, I'm a trauma therapist, but can healing happen in so many other different ways and places? Absolutely. Holistic, I'm totally for that, right? But we also have a great resource at our disposal, which is God, right? For those of us who are Christians, and I don't pretend to know everything, right? And the great thing as a EMDR therapist, but as a Christian person myself, is that there is limits to my knowledge and understanding, and I always have the ability to be inviting the Holy Spirit into those sessions, right? And to prompt not only the person that I'm working with, but myself, and to tap into that level of healing too can be incredibly powerful, right? So again, just honoring and recognizing that not everybody has to go to therapy. So when I had used the term like developmental trauma, that's actually complex PTSD, right? So again, trauma that happens within childhood, where it's a relationship that you're dependent on for survival, which is our parents, and it's a close, and it's been long standing. That's complex trauma. And so what's the first step to working with anybody who's experienced PTSD or complex trauma? It's reestablishing safety. So again, I talked about some of those strategies of grounding the body in the present, because the mind and the symptoms, or the triggers and the physical reactions that's happening, is because it's being triggered in the present, but the body still feels like it's living in the past. So I start working with clients to really help them be more present oriented, give them skills that they can ground themselves so that they can help them not feel like they're in danger anymore, right? And so we just slowly start building up those skills. And then even just recognizing that, one of the most important pieces of healing is having, if you are in therapy, that you trust your therapist, that you have a positive relationship, that you feel you can convey your needs, and that they understand you and they're attuned to you. So again, I always say to folks, if folks aren't comfortable with me, and I'm not like a nice, comfortable shoe, more than happy to go somewhere else, right? I'll transfer you to another therapist in the clinic. So again, the value of just having a relationship where somebody sees and listens to you, right? Too. But all those grounding pieces initially is how I start to slowly work. And then when I do EMDR, it's all about building skills and resources, right? Again, just the example of the 5 senses, right? Just again, getting you to be able to learn how to calm and regulate yourself. A very common response and a natural tendency is to not believe what's happened to us, right? So if anything, a lot of times it's just really helping folks to validate what they've experienced, because again, when we don't have that support, or left on our own, we think we're Trump. Like I'll just use, we think we're being overly dramatic, right? Or our memory is so fragmented, we're not so clear if we're making it up or it's actually real, right? So often what I do in those moments, to be honest, I just invite the Holy Spirit into it, right? I use that person's faith to bring clarity, right? And then again, if we have a sense of what life was like during that time, or what common experiences were, or what who was available to you, or what was happening in your home, I mean, from a psychoeducational perspective, I can tell you what research and what tells us some of the struggles that we have as a result of harm, right? So again, it's I do not impose, I do not make meaning out of people's stories. I guide them, I help them to uncover, and And what I've learned with even with EMDR too is that the more we kind of tap into some of these memories, new memories come forward as well, right? But again, I honor what you're saying, and I always invite the Holy Spirit to help that person understand what is true for them. And so really the challenge is not so much that there's a false memory, but it's actually more about validating their own experience because it was never done for them.
All right, if we could thank Karen for tonight. If I haven't been in touch with you by email and you would like to receive the recording and a couple of those handouts, you can write your name and your email address over there. And I can also tell you about the next workshop in May, which is still to be determined. But thank you for coming tonight, and have a safe trip home.
Thank you.